It didn't start with headlines or hashtags. It started with silence, unnerving, deliberate silence that spread through palace halls like a slow fog. One by one, the payments stopped. No more quiet deposits into obscure accounts. No more maintenance bills covered without question. The financial lifeline that once tethered Camilla's extended family to royal generosity had been cut by none other than Prince William himself. The first sign came when a cousin of Camilla's, who had quietly relied on a monthly stipend, suddenly missed her payment. Then came word from a small estate in Gloucester where property caretakers reported abrupt funding halts. Within hours, whispers turned to frenzy, and before the ink on the royal finance ledger could dry, the media had latched onto the story with claws out. But the real story didn't begin in a spreadsheet. It began in an English countryside study where an aging man sat down with a recorder and a glass of whiskey. Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's ex-husband, had intended his recording as a private memoir for his children, a quiet reflection on a life spent within and just outside the royal orbit. But when that recording leaked, it detonated like a grenade in a room full of china. His voice, gruff and deliberate, didn't just speak of broken hearts, it spoke of manipulation, of secrets hidden beneath polished smiles, of a long game played in shadows. He accused Camilla of building something far more complex than a social circle. According to him, she'd constructed an invisible empire, one built on shell companies, strategic alliances, and a quiet siphoning of wealth that ran alongside the royal family's own financial arteries. And for William, that recording wasn't just inconvenient, it was personal. By the time he'd heard the full audio, the palace was already spinning. Legal teams, PR advisors, and senior aides scrambled to prepare statements and damage control plans. But William wasn't interested in spin. He listened to the recording in its entirety, twice. Then he closed the file, stood up, and asked a single question. Is it true? What followed was a forensic audit that stretched back decades. Quietly, meticulously, William's team pulled threads from Camilla's financial dealings. What they found was not illegal, but it was indefensible. Over £5 million a year funneled through complicated networks, charitable trusts, offshore entities, advisory payments, all benefiting Camilla's relatives in ways no one could explain without squinting hard and crossing moral lines. And that's when William made his choice. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't ask for a vote. Late at night, with only his private secretary in the room, he signed a single document that ended all financial support to Camilla's extended family, effective immediately. It was ruthless, it was direct, and it sent shockwaves through every corner of the monarchy. Camilla, blindsided, retreated behind her legal team. Charles remained silent, trapped between the woman he'd loved for decades and the son poised to inherit his crown. The official palace statement was a masterclass in saying nothing. But the public didn't need words. They saw what had happened. They felt it in their gut. To the outside world, this wasn't just about family money. This was about the future of the monarchy, about a prince drawing a line in the sand and daring anyone to cross it. And while some praised him for his backbone, others whispered that he'd just cracked the royal family wide open, because behind the wealth and titles and formal portraits, what people now saw was a family at war with itself and a crown that suddenly looked far less stable than it used to. Camilla didn't shout, she didn't cry. She didn't march into a press conference with trembling hands and rehearsed emotion. Instead, she picked up the phone and called her lawyers. The tone of her voice, according to one insider, was ice wrapped in velvet, controlled, crisp, and lethal. She knew what this was. Not a financial dispute, not a family misunderstanding. It was war. Legal briefs were drawn, private investigators were quietly hired, old allies were summoned over tea and shortbread, and behind the veil of royal formality, Camilla prepared to strike back, not with tabloid interviews, but with precision. Her team's strategy was simple: dismantle the narrative, discredit the leak, cast Andrew Parker Bowles as a bitter old man, poisoned by regret and driven by irrelevance. They labeled his memoir a cocktail of half-truths and selective memory. Convenient outrage, decades too late. But there was one problem. Public sentiment wasn't on her side. Camilla had always walked a narrow line with the British public. She'd survived the Diana years, endured the whispers, and eventually won a kind of quiet tolerance. But this time felt different. This wasn't about love triangles, it was about money, power, and the optics were brutal. Millions flowing through complex structures to relatives with no official duties, while citizens watched energy bills soar and food prices bite. Suddenly, the palace gates looked less like tradition and more like insulation from reality. Meanwhile, inside Parliament, murmurs turned into speeches. Backbenchers rose with furrowed brows and furiously highlighted reports. Transparency, they said. Accountability. The monarchy, once considered off limits, was now fair game. Political leaders across the spectrum seized the moment. Proposals were floated to review the sovereign grant. A few even whispered what had once been unthinkable, that maybe, just maybe, it was time to revisit the monarchy's role entirely. But the fallout wasn't just political. It was emotional. At the heart of it stood Charles, husband to one, father to the other. Stuck between fire and stone, his own silence became a story in itself. Every non-comment from the palace press office became a headline. Every appearance scrutinized, every gesture dissected. Sources close to the king described him as sleepless, pacing the halls of Buckingham with a look that hadn't been seen since Diana's final days. Those who had once been trusted intermediaries now found their calls unanswered. "He's unraveling," one courtier confided. "Not in public, never in public, but in private, he's lost." And still, William didn't blink. He attended engagements, shook hands, cut ribbons, but those who met him in person noticed something different. A hardness behind the eyes, a focus that didn't waver, even when the cameras clicked too close. Friends said he had never been more certain about anything, that this was his moment to define the future, even if it meant breaking the past. Catherine, recovering from her own battles, stood quietly beside him when she could. Her presence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Just a look, a touch, a whisper, each a signal that he wasn't standing alone. Inside their private quarters, she reportedly told him, they'll forgive the silence, but they won't forgive pretending nothing happened. Beyond the palace, across the Commonwealth, the ripple effect continued. Caribbean leaders drafted statements of independence. Australian MPs called for another referendum. Canadian broadcasters openly debated removing the monarch's portrait from currency. The royal drama wasn't just a local tabloid frenzy anymore. It had become a global reckoning. And still, the tension kept building. No one could tell where the breaking point lay, but everyone sensed it was coming, and when it hit, the crown wouldn't just wobble, it might fall. Journalists camped outside royal residences like vultures circling a wounded beast. Buckingham Palace, once a symbol of permanence, now felt like the eye of a brewing storm. Inside, everything was locked in a grim standstill. Meetings dragged late into the night, not with laughter or champagne, but with clashing voices and the clatter of reports tossed onto polished oak tables. The king refused to choose publicly. His counselors begged for a unified front, but Charles only nodded, sighed, and retreated into solitude. He wasn't built for these kinds of battles. Not the kind where love and duty pulled in opposite directions. His mind returned often to his mother, how she would have handled it, how decisively she might have acted. But he wasn't Elizabeth, he was Charles, and this war was unlike any his mother had faced. Camilla's lawyers kept filing motions, statements, rebuttals. None of it mattered. The public didn't trust legalese. They trusted what they could feel, and what they felt was betrayal, not just from her, but from a system that had enabled so much to happen behind closed doors. Royal defenders scrambled to hold the line, but every time they plugged one leak, another emerged. A leaked spreadsheet here, an old text message there, quiet testimonies from former aides who suddenly found themselves invited onto podcasts and primetime news panels. They spoke in soft tones, but their words hit hard. He knew where the money was going. He always suspected but never spoke. It was understood. Don't ask, don't look. Meanwhile, William stayed silent, not cold, not cruel, just still, almost regal in a way that was unsettling. He didn't need to yell. He'd already made his move, and in doing so, he'd redrawn the royal battlefield. Inside royal circles, he was called everything from visionary to traitor. Younger staffers admired him, said he was the first royal in years who acted like a leader instead of a hostage to tradition. Older aides were less kind, said he didn't understand understand what he was breaking, that some compromises weren't cowardice, they were survival. One proposal began to surface more and more among palace officials: a reconciliation summit, quiet, discreet, no cameras, just Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine. 4 people, 1 crisis. The goal wasn't agreement, it was détente. But even that seemed impossible. William wouldn't attend unless certain conditions were met. Camilla refused to negotiate under what she called emotional blackmail. Charles delayed, hoping the fire would burn itself out. Outside, the country wasn't waiting. Public trust in the monarchy hit a historic low. Polls showed a dramatic generational divide. Voters under 40 no longer viewed the monarchy as untouchable. Some didn't view it as necessary at all. What once had been whispers in university halls were now open questions on national television. Should the monarchy survive? Should William succeed? Should this be the end? Yet not everyone wanted it to end. Some saw opportunity, a new beginning, a monarchy that could own its flaws and rebuild on honesty, not illusion. And in those circles, William's decision wasn't just brave, it was necessary. A long overdue step toward dragging the institution into the daylight. But that vision came with a cost. Within palace walls, portraits hung slightly askew,